In wrapping up this semester's look at physical anthropology, your textbook includes a chapter on humanity's environmental impact. That's not especially common among anthropology texts, but I think it is an exceptionally good idea. After all, anthropology is the only science that attempts to study all aspects of the human condition, and our ongoing relationship with the environment is definitely within that scope. On the other hand, unlike the other chapters, today I'll digress a bit more from the book than usual. Human ecology, or the relationship that the human species has with its environment, is a major component of both human biology and culture. A change in any one of the three will inevitably lead to a change in the others. We've talked throughout the semester about the circular relationship between culture and biology, but in reality, there's a third part of that relationship, the environment. Each one of the three is both the cause of and the result of the other two. So understanding how we influence the environment is as important as understanding how it influences us, since they're really two sides of the same coin. In speaking of the relationship of humanity to its environment, it's not uncommon to hear that we are the most successful or dominant species on the planet, but what does that mean? If the rate at which we destroy our own environment is a measure, then sure, we're the most successful, but frankly, that sounds more like it should be a measure of the least successful species. When most people say that humans are the dominant species on the planet, without really thinking the matter through, they probably mean that there are more humans than any other species. However, our 8.2 billion population, though undeniably huge, is dwarfed by many other species like ants or bacteria. There are quadrillions of ants in the world, not just billions. Now, granted, there are many species of ants and only one species of human. But the truth is, it's not entirely clear in an ecological sense what dominance is. So when we look for ways to understand humans' relationships with our environment, we have to go beyond simple ideas like success. We need to look for more sophisticated sorts of interactions, and we need to look back to that triadic relationship among environment, biology, and culture. Remember that throughout the semester, we've defined culture as a non-biological way of adapting to the environment. Rather than changing biologically, as most species, humans have learned to change their behaviors and technologies to adapt to the environment. A slightly different dimension of the same sort of cultural adaptation is that we also change the environment to suit our biology. All hominins have a basically tropical physiology. When we moved to cold environments, we used technologies like fire, clothing, and architecture to create microenvironments that were warm enough for our bodies. Agriculture is similarly a change in the environment. Rather than moving to where food is, as hunter-gatherers and all other animals do, farmers bring the food to them. Many animals make these sorts of changes to their environments, especially when building dens or nests, for example, but humans do it to a much greater degree. Part of cultural behavior, then, is changing our behaviors to fit the environment, and part is changing the environment to fit our biology. But the environment is a complex, highly integrated system. Changing any component of such a complex system will also bring on many unintended consequences, and those are ultimately the root of the problems we currently have with environmental issues. Most of our real problems with the environment began when hunter-gatherers became sedentary. Environmental changes at the end of the Pleistocene meant that hunter-gatherers in certain environments no longer had to move around the landscape. That set in motion a series of events that ultimately led to many of the social problems we still suffer from today. Sedentism leads to population growth. Population growth drives the adoption of agriculture. Last lecture, we saw how agriculture leads to malnutrition. Meanwhile, sedentism means people are living nearer their own garbage, and animal husbandry puts them in close proximity to animals, both of which cause endemic diseases that are absent in hunter-gatherers. You read about the role of zoonotic infections in human evolution a couple chapters ago. All of these problems drive civilizations to change their culture to compensate for the problems, which creates other new or unforeseen consequences. In fact, a careful study of human history since the end of the Pleistocene is one long story of unintended consequences and negative environmental fallout from sedentary human settlements. In solving one problem, we inevitably create a different one, and that process drives history. Of course, the major contemporary ecological issue confronting humans is anthropogenic climate change. That is, changes in world climate patterns that are directly caused by human activities. This is the source of much controversy and a large portion of this chapter in the textbook. But the debate boils down ultimately to a couple interrelated questions. We know the world's climate is changing. That much is undeniable. The questions are, did we cause it to change, and do we need to worry about how to change it back? The overwhelming majority of qualified, credentialed climate scientists answers both questions yes. This diagram was produced by research by James Powell. It's a pie chart, though you'd be forgiven for not realizing that right away. In 2013 and 2014, Powell and his assistants conducted an exhaustive review of all peer-reviewed scientific journals concerning the environment, climate, and global ecology. They found that out of 24,210 articles about the environment, only 5 rejected the idea that humans were causing climate change. That proportion is represented by the almost invisible yellow slice of the pie chart pointing straight up. Even that slice is actually 10 times larger than it really should be. If it were the correct size, it'd be too narrow to represent in the image, narrower than a single pixel. The rest of the pie chart, the blue, represents the proportion of climate scientists who agree that humans are causing global climate change. So the answer to the first question, are we causing climate change, is as resounding a yes as science can ever be expected to provide. But even if that answer had been no, that wouldn't change the answer to our second question. Do we need to worry about climate change? Even if the current changes in climate aren't anthropogenic, that doesn't let us off the hook. Our current world civilization relies on the climate in innumerable ways. If that climate changes, civilization may not end, but our civilization certainly will. No, climate change will not destroy the world. There will still be a world here. It won't destroy the human species. We will survive. It won't even be the end of civilization. Some form of civilization will survive, but it won't be our civilization. The world that these hypothetical post-climate change humans will live in will be so different from ours as to be unrecognizable. It's not unreasonable or selfish to want our own way of life to endure, and for that to happen, we need to counter climate change. Luckily, anthropology can give us a wide variety of insights into how human cultures cause, deal with, and adapt to climate change. By looking back at past episodes of ecological change that played out on a smaller scale, we can start to plan our own response to the current global crisis. One example of past cultures degrading their environment in unforeseen ways is deforestation. Cutting down large numbers of trees has a whole host of ecological effects: the destruction of habitat for wildlife and a loss of all the benefits such wildlife provides, increased soil erosion, increased drying of soils, both of which make agriculture much more difficult, and loss of the future use of the wood. Modern cultures are not the first to deforest their landscapes. Dense populations in cities have always cut down the local forests for a variety of reasons: to clear fields for farming, for building materials to house the population, for cooking fuel to prepare the food, or even for fuel to burn limestone to create plaster to plaster the walls of houses. Neolithic houses in what are now Israel and Jordan were plastered because thick plaster walls are cooler in the hot summers, but Israel and Jordan are also now mostly treeless because Neolithic farmers cut down all the trees to fuel the plaster fires. The deforestation and accompanying ecological degradation forced Near Eastern cultures to adopt new, less comfortable housing styles. Deforestation has also been blamed for the collapse of whole civilizations. Mayan civilization in the Yucatan probably collapsed when deforested rainforest soils eroded to the point where they couldn't yield crops anymore. Some scholars have suggested that in about 900 AD, the entire Petén rainforest just didn't exist. We also have an excellent example of deforestation right here in the Midwest: the Native American city of Cahokia outside of St. Louis, which had as many as 20,000 inhabitants 800 years ago, may have been abandoned for lack of nearby wood supplies. Modern deforestation is a bigger problem because it occurs on a much larger and more global scale. Rather than cutting down trees for pasturage to feed themselves, Brazilian cattle herders are now cutting down huge swaths of the Amazon for ranches that feed billions of people. And as interconnectedness expands around the world, so do road systems that now cut across long stretches of formerly pristine, untouched forest. Past attempts to limit deforestation have been half-hearted in most countries. The largest stands of forest in the world today are mostly in poor developing countries, whose economic strategies include resource extraction, including the extraction of the resource timber. From many governments' perspectives, a halt to deforestation is not in their political or economic interests. Also, important decisions in these countries are often made in the capital with little or no concern or consultation with local communities. Even when governments have attempted to control deforestation, they've often taken a coercive or punitive approach. This is where good applied anthropology can be and has been of great help. Civilization in general has caused a lot of problems for a lot of people, but it also makes it possible to support what would otherwise be unsustainably huge populations. This massive population explosion, which we'll look at in more detail in a bit, comes at the cost of many other species, a problem we call loss of biodiversity. Biodiversity is a measure of how many species exist in the ecosystem, and generally speaking, greater biodiversity is better for the ecosystem. Diverse systems are stronger, more resilient, and less likely to collapse. But human activities since the Pleistocene have greatly decreased biodiversity in our ecosystems. In this way, we might consider our own species very successful. If a successful species can outcompete its competitors and take over ecological niches previously held by other species, then humans are extremely successful. We've caused the extinction of more species of animals than anyone really knows. This loss of biodiversity, like deforestation, is not a new aspect of human ecology. Paleontologists use the term mass extinction for events in the Earth's past when a large proportion of the world's biodiversity vanished in a geologically very short period of time. According to the textbook, there have been 15 such events in the last 570 million years. There was one 250 million years ago when the continents joined into Pangaea and world climate patterns shifted. There was another one 65 million years ago when an asteroid hit the Earth and killed out most of the dinosaurs and other animals. And according to some scholars, we're undergoing a third mass extinction right now as a result of human activities. This is one reason why some geologists are now suggesting that the Holocene epoch has ended, and we are now in a new geological epoch, the Anthropocene, in which the most significant force shaping the world is humans. The earlier stages of this mass extinction predate the Anthropocene, however, and they even predate the Holocene. The human-caused extinctions first began at the end of the Pleistocene, as modern humans emerged from Africa and settled the globe. Especially in North America, the extinctions around this expansion get gathered under the name of the overkill hypothesis. At the end of the Pleistocene, many mammals had evolved large bodies to deal with the cold temperatures. When the climate got warmer, many of these large species would naturally be poorly adapted, and many of them did indeed disappear. However, they disappeared much more quickly than one would expect. And the ones that vanished fastest were in regions like North America, so that their extinction coincided with the first settlement of humans in the region. The basic idea is this: humans are excellent hunters. These animals had evolved without humans, so they weren't particularly wary of them. After all, mastodons stood 12 feet tall and weighed 8 tons. Why should they be afraid of a 5-foot-tall, 150-pound hairless ape? So, when humans first appeared in North America, the megafauna, the big animals, didn't know to run. Humans hunted these trusting megafauna to extinction. We killed them off faster than they could adapt to the new climate. Every North American species over 1 ton went extinct, and half of those over 70 pounds did, within a couple thousand years of humans entering the Western Hemisphere. And that's not all. There were also mass megafauna extinctions following the human colonization of Australia 50,000 years ago, and the giant moa bird in New Zealand went extinct only a few centuries after humans settled there. This photo, by the way, is of a museum recreation of a moa bird. Except in Africa, Europe, and Asia, where large animals had evolved with human predators, wherever humans went, large animals went extinct. Now, the reasons for this are obvious. Large animals are easily located sources of a lot of food. The problem is that something that big is hard to kill. Without sophisticated hunting technology like horses and guns, the easiest way to kill a large-bodied herbivore is to cause the whole herd to stampede off a cliff, as Native Americans often did in prehistory. At the prehistoric site of Olson Chubbuck in Colorado, Native Americans stampeded 190 giant bison off a cliff to die in the canyon below, but then they just killed a whole herd. There's more food than their small community could ever eat before it rotted. Only about 100 of the bison were fully butchered. A couple dozen more were partially butchered, and more than a dozen weren't touched at all by the hunters. The hunters themselves didn't consider this particularly wasteful because at the time there were millions of bison on the North American plains. On the timescale of a human lifetime, it seemed like no amount of waste could ever impact the species, but stretched across several thousand years, it did. In addition to overhunting, agriculture also destroys biodiversity, and not just through deforestation and loss of habitat. The whole point of agriculture is to transform a landscape with a lot of useless plants to one with a lot of one kind of particularly useful plant called a crop. Monocrop fields are really fragile. The potato blight in 19th century Ireland should not have been particularly troublesome since it only hit one kind of plant, potatoes. Except that potatoes were virtually the only food crop grown in Ireland at the time. 1 million Irish died because of one infection in one crop. In the modern world, humans are still destroying biodiversity, though the reasons are somewhat different. Most species are being lost today because of a combination of two reasons: invasive species and loss of habitat. The latter is pretty straightforward. There are so many people around today that we have to destroy other species' natural habitats to turn them into our own, either for housing developments and outlet malls in the West or for agricultural land in the rest of the world. If we live there, other species can't. Invasive species are a more insidious threat because they look like nature just taking its course. When humans move into an area, they bring with them a whole variety of new species: crops, livestock, pets, hangers-on like weeds or rats. These species go where humans go because they've evolved to live with us. And as we change the environment to fit our own needs, we also fit their needs. These new species outcompete their native competitors, driving those species into extinction. That in itself wouldn't be either good or bad. It's just natural selection in action. But where humans go is everywhere. And the same species follow us everywhere, so that they also spread across the world, and biodiversity decreases throughout the world. Right now, the Asian carp, an invasive species, is proceeding to destroy the native fish populations in the Mississippi River drainage and threatening to invade the Great Lakes and do likewise. Where did these fish come from? They were imported to be farmed for food in closed ponds until they escaped into the wild waterways after floods. That is, if it weren't for humans wanting cheap, tasty fish sticks, the native fish populations would not be in danger of extermination. All of humans' negative impacts on the environment really trace back to our population. Though there are species that outnumber us, we have an extremely large population, and that population is undergoing an unprecedented explosion. One so big that some people believe the whole planet will be insufficient to support us all. Industrialization has made it possible to feed billions of people. Modern science has also greatly decreased human mortality rates, so that many more people are living for much longer these days. Consequently, our population stands at 8.2 billion, and it's growing worldwide at a rate of about 0.91% per annum. Now that number seems really small, but in fact it is huge. That growth rate means that the population will double roughly every 77 years, barring disruption. 77 years from now, if nothing changes, the world population will be roughly 16.4 billion. 77 years after that, it will double again to 32.8 billion. Obviously, no one believes this will happen. Given the trouble the world has with negative environmental changes and malnourishment today, something will intervene well before we reach that point, and it will probably be massive famine, war, or epidemic. This question is actually one of the first issues we brought up at the beginning of the semester. The problem that population grows exponentially, but resources only grow arithmetically. This principle was first recognized by Thomas Malthus in 1798. He suggested that three processes keep populations from growing too big: war, famine, and epidemic. Certainly, all three are endemic to the world today, and if things do not change, they will become even more prevalent. People will fight, starve, and die until there are few enough people to be fed. What can be done? First, population growth must be halted. Total fertility rate should fall. The total fertility rate is the total number of children a woman gives birth to, on average, over the entirety of her reproductive life. Global TFR is a variable that changes over time. For the population to remain constant, TFR must equal the replacement rate, the value of TFR at which population stays constant. On average, each woman should have 2.1 children. 2 children to replace herself and her husband in the next generation, and the occasional woman will have a 3rd child to account for childhood mortality. Today, much of the Western world has reached this birth rate, or even dipped below it. The US total fertility rate is about 1.78, but much of the developing world is still well above it. The total worldwide TFR in 2024 was 2.41, and the median developing world TFR is around 5. In Niger, a 2024 estimate puts the TFR as high as 6.73. What can be done? Well, we'll watch a documentary next time that gives us a good strategy for reducing fertility. Watch out for it. But even if we halted population growth tomorrow, that would not resolve the population pressures we're experiencing today. So a second change that must take place to avoid Malthusian population controls is to more equitably distribute resources. Some ecologists believe that the amount of resources produced in the world today are more than enough to provide a stable, comfortable way of life for 8 billion people. The only problem is that the United States and a few other countries consume a much greater percentage of world resources than their populations alone would suggest. This means that the many developing nations are left with considerably fewer resources than their populations warrant. It is possible that a more equitable distribution of the resources we already have would alleviate some of the problems that cause Malthusian scenarios like war or epidemic. To give a sense of what that would entail, let's do some extremely simplified back-of-the-envelope calculations. The world GDP in 2023 was about $105 trillion for a population of about 8 billion. So an equitable distribution of resources would equate to a per capita income of $13,125 per person per year. This is a major increase in standard of living for many developing nations, but a huge reduction for the developed world. The US per capita income in 2023 was $64,187 per person per year. So the average American would take an almost 80% pay cut. However, the per capita income in Haiti in 2023 was only $1,240 per person per year. Haitians would receive a 958% pay raise. Such wealth redistribution would amount to the largest act of altruism ever undertaken. We discussed earlier in the semester how primates are evolved to certain levels of altruism. This may be the first time in history that a species' whole continued existence relies on sustained altruism. In conclusion, I know this lecture can come across as depressing and pessimistic, but the optimistic lesson to be learned is that anthropology, and more generally science, allows us to think about these problems in a productive manner. Earlier cultures couldn't even conceive of ecological problems on such a large scale, and while we still struggle with finding solutions, at least we're able to understand the obstacles confronting us. With the proper use of science and our evolutionary drive to be social and altruistic, we'll be able to pull together to solve these problems.